All right, good morning, guys. We're going to keep going with our lesson for today about Charles Darwin and his organisms that he found in the Galapagos Island near South America. So Darwin collected birds from several kinds of from the Galapagos Island. So the birds were a little different from one island to the next. So he was pretty much investigating why this occurred. So Darwin would learn that the Lerns were all types of finches. So they were all the same species, but they all have different characteristics. So he concluded that the finches species were all related to a single common ancestor species that came from the mainland. So remember, the mainland was somewhere in South America that had traveled to the Galapagos Island, and for some reason, these they had different characteristics. So over time, different finches have developed these different beak types and sizes that were well suited for the from the food they ate. Beak shape is an example of an adaptation. So adaptation is just an inherited behavior or physical characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce in its environment. So same thing with beak, right? So the beak is able, depending on the beak shape, is going to depend on what they can eat. So for example, if I have a very skinny beak, like the one right here of this little hummingbird, then you're going to be able to get the nectar from the flowers. But if you have a really thick beak, like let's say a parrot or something like that, you won't be able to get into these flowers. You're going to be able to eat larger things like, let's say, nuts or things like that, or break these nuts. So in addition, so birds with a narrow prying beak can grasp insects. Those with long, pointed, sharp beaks can pick up cacti. Short, hook-beaked tear open fruit, while short, wide beaks crush seeds. All right. So Darwin has thought that he had observed during the voyage of the Beagle. Okay, during this time, Darwin was convinced that organisms change over time, but he wanted to understand why or how that is done. So Darwin reasoned that plants or animals that arrived on the Galapagos Islands had faced conditions different from those on the nearby mainland. So Darwin hypothesized that species change over many generations and become better adapted to these new conditions. Darwin hypothesized, her hypothesis was an idea that contributed to an important new knowledge. Later, he and other scientists were able to use this and test and develop the scientific theory that we all know today. So remember, a scientific theory has to be based on many different observations and experiments. It is not, most people think that it is a theory, so you kind of just make whatever up for you to understand what's going on, but in reality, a scientific theory has to be based on many experiments and observation for it to even be called a theory. So we're going to move on with evolution based on natural selection. So we're going to start looking at what is natural selection, how do these species effectively change from being the same species but having different beaks per se, or different colors, or claw sizes and things like that. So living in a small body of water can be dangerous for fish. So if water conditions become unhealthy, for example, there's nowhere for the fish to go. So too little rain, too many fish, and overgrowth of algae can work together to reduce oxygen levels in water. So when oxygen levels fall too short, we have something called fish kill. Fish kill can wipe out most of the local population of a species of fish. So some individuals, however, usually survive the disaster. These fish will live to reproduce, thus ensuring the species survives. So we really want to think about, why do so many fish die in fish kill and then some live? So you need to think about what traits they have in order to do so. And then when they do survive, will they be able to pass on these traits to their offspring, right? That's what this natural selection process does, is by naturally selecting, where animals are able to resist a certain change in their environment, able to reproduce, and then pass on these traits to be able to resist those same environmental changes that allow them to prosper. So Darwin was searching for this mechanism of why this happened. So after his return to England, Darwin was not satisfied with his theory of evolution. So he struggled to determine the evolution's mechanism. Remember, a mechanism is a natural process by which something takes place. So Darwin himself was asking how these organisms could change over time, because remember, this takes many years, decades, sometimes hundreds of years, thousands of years for these mechanisms to really occur. So Darwin started asking himself, how could this be? Why does one species become better adapted to these new conditions? And to solve the mystery, Darwin performed many experiments and read the works of other naturalists and scientists. So we can also start on artificial and natural selection. So we can also do this through experiments by doing artificial selection. So artificial just means fake. So you're selecting these traits yourself. So it's not natural. You are selectively putting specific traits together, just like we would right here on this corn. Okay, so we have this corn, for example. This is blue corn, but it has some yellow in it. You see all these yellow specks. Same thing over here. We have this yellow corn, but instead we have these blue specks. So we can infer that these were artificially selected to see which one was a recessive gene, which one had the dominant gene, what occurs. That's what your experiments are going to do. So Darwin studied farms and pet animals produced by artificially selecting them. So in artificial selection, only individuals with a desired trait, such as color, are bred. So Darwin himself bred pigeons with large fan-shaped tails. So he repeatedly allowed only those pigeons with many tail feathers to mate. In this process, Darwin produced pigeons with 2 or 3 times the usual amount of tail feathers. So Darwin thought that process similar to artificial selection might happen in nature, but he wondered what natural process performed the selection. So he was experimenting on these pigeons. So this pigeon, for example, had a lot of tail feathers, and they had fan shape, so they were spread out. So when he realized that he only mated these pigeons, then he started to realize that these pigeons had even longer tails. So he started to wonder why they are having these longer tail feathers if he's mating the same exact pigeons. So Darwin understood how evolution could work when he read an essay about Thomas Malthus. So Malthus noted that both animals and humans can produce many offspring. So in all, the offspring survive. So the world will quickly become overpopulated. So there would not be enough food for everyone, and part of the population would starve. So Darwin realized that some individuals have traits that help them to survive and reproduce. If these traits are hereditary, they can be passed on to the next generation. Gradually, over many generations, though, more and more individuals will have this helpful trait. So remember, heredity is just the ability for traits to be passed down to other generations, to your offspring, to your children. Darwin waited a very long time to publish all his ideas. He thought that they might be too revolutionary for the public to accept. Then in 1858, though, Alfred Russel Wallace sent Darwin a letter. Wallace had also read Malthus' work and discovered the same mechanism for evolution. So the next year, Darwin published his theory on the origin of the species. In this book, though, Darwin proposed that evolution occurs by the means of natural selection. So natural selection is just the process by which individuals that are better adapted to the environment are most likely to survive and reproduce than the other members of the same species. So when he pretty much got this confirmation from this other scientist that, wow, like this also worked for me, then he was able to publish his book. And he was pretty sure, remember back then, they were very religious. So this was a very criticized origin of the species, because, you know, during that time, it was like the species were kind of just made out of nowhere. There was really no this evolution process. There should not be this change. It should be this is how the animal was created, and that is it. But over time, scientists and things like that went had other ideas and how this evolution process really did occur. So yeah, so how did this occur? So Darwin identified 3 factors that affect the natural selection. So these 3 factors are going to be overproduction, variation, and competition. So first, there must be overproduction. Darwin knew that most species produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Secondly, there must be a variation. So members of a population differ from one another in many of their traits. For example, sea turtles may differ in color, size, the ability to crawl quickly on sand, and shell hardness. Such variations are hereditary, passed down from parent to offspring through genetic material. So finally, there must also be competition, which is a struggle among living things to get necessary amounts of food, water, and shelter, which in many species, there's so many offspring that are produced that there's not enough resources. So not enough food, water, or living space for all of them. So this goes back to, for example, let's say cats or dogs. They have an overproduction of all of these offspring. So they cannot all possibly survive. So obviously if you have a cat or a dog at home, they are able to survive because you're helping them take care of it. You're giving them, let's say, food for the kids, for the offspring to survive on. You're giving them milk, things like that. You're taking them to the vet, so they have a very high chance of surviving. But realistically, they are not able to, right, in the real world. So if you have a dog or a cat per se giving birth in the middle of an alley for no reason, then obviously they're not all going to survive. They're only going to have to be invested in a specific 1 or 2 for them to be able to survive. Then we have a variation, which is just a difference in what is occurring. So they can be a different color, they can be a different size based on, remember, genetics is based on 2 parents. So it kind of just, it depends on what the traits that are being passed down. Well, also we have competition. So they are struggling to survive based on the resources that are already there. Okay. Same thing with selection. So selection was observed by Darwin, and he realized that some variations make individuals better adapted to their environment. So those individuals that were more likely to survive and reproduce, their offspring, they were able to survive, reproduce, and the offspring would inherit the helpful characteristics. So the offspring in turn would be more likely to pass on these genetic material. After many generations, more members of the population would have the helpful characteristics. So for example, these turtle shells. So turtle shells, or turtles that go into the beach, for example, lay their eggs, things like that. It is going to be very helpful if the eggshells were strong enough to make sure that some of the predators were not able to eat the turtles inside of the eggs. But also you need to make sure that you're passing on these traits for the baby turtles to be able to be fast and strong enough to reach the ocean before the predators arrive and eat them alive. Okay, so a change in the environment can also be affecting an organism's ability to survive and may therefore lead to natural selection. For example, a storm can topple many trees in a forest, but trees that are better adapted are going to be able to withstand the strong winds and survive the damage. So this is also very popular in a forest. If there is a hurricane, for example, in an area where it has a forest or where a lot of trees are, things like that. So after a hurricane, let's say out of a population of 100 trees, we have, let's say a population of 30, 40 that survive the hurricane winds. So over time, those that are stronger are going to be able to withstand hurricane gusts and wind. So for that to happen, though, they're going to be able to pass on these traits that allow them to be stronger. Let's say they have a better root system or something like that. They're able to withstand. So over time, the trees that grow in that area are going to be able to withstand hurricanes that pass by there. So I'm actually going to pause here for today. We're going to keep going on with genes and natural selection, where Darwin goes on and tries to really explain these genes and this genetic material tomorrow. Remember, make sure you are completing your discussion questions. You are starting to work on your lesson check questions, and we will see each other face-to-face on Zoom tomorrow. Have a good day.